Alrighty, welcome back to the Soul Stories channel. Alright guys, you might be thinking, where is Albert Kim? Well, I'm your host Michael. I've got Charles with me today, and Albert has given us the blessing to come on his channel, host this video, so welcome in. We're
Thank
going to
you,
be
Albert.
talking about a TV show that we are both very excited about. Albert, oh my god, I'm talking about Albert. Charles, can you tell us what show are we talking about today, man?
Pachinko, my man. It's season two's debuting, I think today, August 23rd on
Mm-hmm.
Apple TV. It's based off the novel by Jin, it's been a historic novel on Obama's book list and everything.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, it's Apple TV. Let's get it, dude. Season two, for those who don't know.
Yeah, dude. This show, I think for me, when I think about like Asian representation on TV, this show is huge because, I mean, obviously like Lee Min-jin herself is not very much involved with this show. She's been pretty public about it. She didn't really think like represents her vision.
Right.
So she's kind of distanced herself. She doesn't want to work on a show. That's her right, right? Like she's an author. She doesn't have to work on a TV show. But everybody that's involved in making this show is Korean American or Asian American. Soo Hyo, the showrunner, she's Korean American. The directors that she got for the first season, they are all Korean American. Justin Chon, Kogonada. These are huge names in Hollywood that stepped up to bat and they're like, let's make a TV show that shows the American audience what Korea is all about.
And what I think happened with the sort of quote unquote riff, I actually got the pleasure of meeting her through my career, and it was just a side conversation. But one of the questions in the audience was, how do you feel about the TV show? And she definitely has, just as you were saying, her reservations. And as an author, as an artist, in her perspective, it wasn't translated perfectly onto screen. So I can completely understand that. But to your point, when I first watched the show and it first came out, it took me by surprise because for me, I'm 30 years old, having grown up as a Korean American in Arizona, back and forth with Korea. This was the first time I saw my story being told on TV. So the way that I took it, because I love the book too. And as an artist as well, I understand when something gets misconstrued in a non-perfect way for you, you feel some type of way. But this manifested into its own art form. Yes, it's not Pachinko, the novel, the book that we all came to adore that made the story popular, which was probably the first art form that represented Asians. So credit to Lee Min-jin. But this evolved into the 2024 media landscape. The aforementioned actors that were put in there, Justin Chon, Korean Americans, Koreans, it turned into this own behemoth. And now I start to look at it as its own thing, not so much always comparing it to the book. And it has legs of its own. We're into season two. But that was the first thing for me when I first saw it. It was wow. This was and then Beef came out after, which really captured the Asian American experience even more. But before that, this was the first thing where I was like, finally, I was probably 29 when it came out, 28. I've waited 28 years for my life for something in Western media to come out and tell our story. And that's where the infatuation started for me.
Dude, you put it so well said. Like, it shows the Korean experience and what we've been through as a people in a way that I don't think, like Apple TV, right? There's a lot of white people watching Apple TV because Apple's a huge company, right? I don't think anybody in America really, other than Korean Americans, knows the story the way that we've seen it on that screen.
For sure.
It was just incredible to see, like, you know, even for me, like, I'm half Korean. I have a white father, right? Like, just knowing that he watched that TV show and got to learn about it, and our family talking about it, we're like, we didn't know all this stuff about the Japanese occupation. There was so many things that we learned. So that's definitely one thing. And I love that you mentioned Beef in there, because I think Beef is another really good show for us to talk about in the future, just with representing, like, what is it that Korean Americans go through and what can we create in Hollywood, right? I think that show's huge as well.
And then more honing in even on like how I identified with how I think all immigrants and but this is a specific Korean story, so I'll kind of deep dive into there. But for me, it shows I mean, that's the story. It was four generations of Koreans. And the coolest thing to me, whether I hear stories from my grandpa or my father, every generation, it doesn't matter, rich, poor, we dealt with the Japanese annexation of
Oh
Korea
yeah.
and everything that followed. My grandpa tells me stories. He grew up Japanese for the first 7 years of his life. And there's another Korean film where they capture the narrative of, I forget the name of it, the narrative of my grandpa's generation. And this just takes it even further. So my mom could watch it and be like, oh, that character is me. And that's kind of how I saw it. I was like, oh, that's my grandpa. Like he grew up in rural Korea, Joseon-shide,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
before, and then he had to deal with Japan. And then it zooms forward for our lives. It goes into, oh man, remind me of the character's name. But the guy who's Japanese and
Okay.
American,
Okay. You're talking about Jin Ha, right? His character.
I think so. The shorter
Yeah.
fella,
He's the banker, right?
the banker. So that
Okay.
is
That's Solomon.
obviously
That's Solomon.
Solomon.
Okay.
He was the most relatable character because
Oh,
I
I
work
related to him so much.
exactly like
Yeah.
the way he has to deal with, am I Korean enough to be Korean? Am I Japanese? Am I American? And then you see
Oh
him
yeah.
fighting through all these influences, like, and then in the end, full circle, he realizes his Koreanness.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to make that deal with the house
Oh,
with
whoa,
the
whoa, whoa,
older
whoa! We
Korean.
haven't even done a spoiler alert yet, baby. We haven't done a
Oh yeah,
spoiler alert.
fair. I'm hoping
Okay.
the audience has read the book at
Yeah.
least or seen
Let's
something.
jump back for a second, okay, real quick.
Yeah.
I loved what you were talking about there, and
The
for me,
generation
like the
thing.
big thing for me is I think that this show portrayed Korea as beautifully as I've ever seen it on screen.
Yes.
I remember watching those early scenes where we're seeing um Sunja
Poverty.
as a kid, right? In like rural Busan area, right? And I'm just like, this is absolutely gorgeous. Because obviously, like Justin Chan did an incredible job with the cinematography. Kogonada,
Yes.
incredible job with the cinematography. Like that fish market, incredible.
Yes.
Great set design. But we're getting into it, right? So, guys, if you haven't watched the show, we're going to give you a spoiler alert and tell you, like, we're going to link to it on Apple TV. So maybe you should stop here if you haven't watched the show first season. But let's talk about some, like, through lines of this plot that we just really connected with and thought were really important. So you're talking about Solomon, right? And let me just talk about Solomon's story at first. For me, one of the most impactful scenes of the premiere episode of the show is when Solomon is in the room with his bosses at the bank, right? And they're breaking the bad news.
Yeah.
And they're telling him, hey man, you are not getting the promotion this year. And he's like, well, what the hell? I'm one of the best stockbrokers on this floor. My numbers are great. My numbers are better than anybody on this floor. Why are you not promoting me? And they're racistly telling him, hey man, it's not happening this year. And then this guy has the absolute balls. Solomon has the balls to be like, hey, you know that deal we're struggling on out in Japan? I'm going to break it for you guys. That one buyer that you can't get to buy up on that hotel plot that you want to build that will pump that stock for that company that you're investing in, I'll get her to sell because she's Korean. I'm going to do it. When I break this deal, you're going to give me that promotion and you're going to give me all the back pay to today's date. And I was like, that's the ballsiest thing I've ever seen. And that was incredible.
It's really interesting how like his goal initially was to satisfy his Western identity. Like he's the reason he moved back to his motherland is because of that promotion, of the capitalism, of that drive to be like, I deserve this. And Tiger Mamish, he saw his opportunity and wanted to seize it. But as we'll get into in a little bit, the initial influence was Western, but then he has to go into this huge journey of self identity. Who am I? And then he realizes that his Korean identity is ultimately what being confident in that is what's going to benefit him in the long run.
All right, so Solomon is one of our main characters. His timeline, his story takes place in 1989-ish. Okay, but we also have to remember that Sunja, his grandmother, her story begins probably in the 1920s, 1930s, in the thick of Japanese annexation, colonization of Korea. So her story begins when she's a little child, and one of her first and biggest memories is the fact that her parents run a boarding house. And some of the people that are living at that boarding house are anti-Japanese protesters. And one of those men that she's quite close with, actually, this man takes her to the fish market, shows her the ropes. This man is hauled away by the Japanese for the rumors about him being, for the rumors about him being drunk and saying some shit about the Japanese.
Yeah.
And the sad thing also is that her mother and father have to report this because they don't want to get in trouble. It's hard, man.
They try to, and so those types of scenes are like the gut-wrenching ones. It shows the veracity, the violence, the degaff. The Japanese didn't care. It was illegal to be Korean. You are a Japanese citizen, and any type of protest against that, even it was a scary time, scary dictatorship. And to your point, like the film, the TV show captures it so well in a cinematic landscape. I had moments during I was watching by myself. I would literally just be pausing. I would have to pause the scene because it's too much for me. Like I imagine my grandma or my mother in that scenario, and tears would just be pouring down my face for like 10 minutes. And I'm not an emotional viewer, honestly, of most content, but man, it's impossible not to see your generational foremothers and fathers just like in those moments. It's gut-wrenching stuff.
Like Sunja herself is like, this is wrong. Like, why are they doing this to him? And as parents, her parents have to explain to her exactly what is happening. And that's hard parenting moments. Having to tell your kid, hey, this man that lives here that you really adore, we had to turn him in because these Japanese people will basically take our business away. They could burn down our house. They could kill us for harboring him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's hard shit to tell a kid, right? So her story is really, really tough because as she grows into a teenager, as she grows into a woman, she actually meets Hansu, who is essentially like, how would you describe him? Like, what is his role as a Korean?
Oh, man. Well,
how Korean is he at this point?
Well, he's such an interesting character, man, because I always think about this with Koreans against any conflict. Or during that time, I always talk with my Korean friends. It's like, hey, if we were in Korea, would you climb up the ladder in Japan and become kind of like we climb up the ladder in America here and become more American, become more Japanese for your family, for your self-sustainability? Or do you fight for what you know you are? And Hans is caught up in those two dynamics. You know, he's right in the middle. And when the Koreans perceive him on first glance, they're like, who's this guy who ditched his country to go be successful and support the enemy, live amongst the enemy, speaks fluent Japanese, has high Japanese, rich connections, affluent connections. But as you watch the show, you see his Korean sympathy, and that's his romance with Sunja starts with that, right? He has a Japanese family and stuff, but you see his Korean identity, his sensitivity. He's battling through it throughout the entire show. Like, oh wait, but he's Korean. But wait, I'm Japanese. And then I found that dynamic so interesting and applicable to a lot of Koreans. It's like during that time, every Korean had that decision tree. It's like, am I gonna go and be successful for my family and get the best well-being for my family, or am I gonna fight for my country and be poor and be killed and always be running in fear and anxiety? I think Hansu does an interesting thing where he tries to help people at a position of power and with scale. You know, it's like if you give a penny to the homeless guy, you're helping in the micro of it all, the micro society. But when you get to a position of power, you get those Japanese people to trust you. Then you can start implementing laws. You know, we see when they move to Osaka, Sunja moves to Osaka with Hanzu, and they start having a family. He has so much sway, and he can pull these levers, it's the conclusion on him is it's a little double-sided. We don't know if we like him or hate him by the end of it. The way he treats Sunja, I think, makes us, for me at least, in the end, dislike him. But you know that he had a horrible childhood as well because he was Korean. And there's some sort of sympathy that comes with that, knowing that he had to struggle. And he chose I'm going to be the best man that I can be, protect my family. He chose that path and rose up the ranks in Japan. So there's no right answer there, but it's just an interesting dynamic and question that I think all Koreans had to go through at that time.
He gets, Sunja pregnant in the first season, and he seems like he's actually quite excited about it. But the offer he makes to her about like what her life is going to be like is very unattractive to her.
Yeah.
He's telling her, he's like, I can't be with you. I really can't be with you because of my position, what I do. And he's like, I can buy you a nice house somewhere. It won't be as if we're together.
The white picket fence dad is not a thing for him, his plan.
She's just like, and she rejects it because she's like, what the hell? And so what's really interesting and what was a really hugely touching scene in the first couple episodes is when she is actually pregnant and she meets who is her future husband, the pastor that is staying at the boarding house. He says to her, do you feel like you could possibly love me? Do you feel like you could possibly learn to love me? And he's just giving this emotional speech about how, she's really saved his life. Like she's nursed him back to health because he was struggling with his health. And he's saying like, I love you for that. Do you feel like over time you could possibly love me? And he's saying like, my brother and I, his wife, we are all going to Japan. We are going to try to make a life there. Would you like to come? Do you think that you could love me? And he's like, even if this child is not mine, I will raise it as if it is mine. Mm-hmm. I remember when I watched that with my fiance, I was like, we were both crying. We were like, this is incredibly emotional because that has to be one of the most romantic things that a man could say to you when you're pregnant and it's not like, and it's not his, right? He's just laying it all out there saying, I will do anything for you because of what you've done for me.
He was the catch-22 with him. He was a huge influencer in the Korean protests at the time, the Korean rebellion movement. And we see his story go through very tumultuous times. He's trying to protect his family, but he can't stop his passion for securing his country's independence. And that gets him in some trouble, we see. And
Oh, yeah, dude. He is, at the end of season 1, he is hauled off by the Japanese. And she is like, what is happening? What has my husband done? He is hauled off. He is taken to jail for his protests, his organizing. Because as we see in season 1, there are some scenes where we follow him to the underground protests. Like, it's kind of like a restaurant canteen, just a place where they all gather to protest and work. Yeah, it's undercover. Like, they keep this a secret, but it gets found out. He gets hauled off to jail. So we're going to see in season 2 what happens with him. So that's kind of like a really big thorough line. But the other thing that we got to get back to is Sunja, when Solomon, her grandson, is still alive, she is trying to influence and remind him of who he is as a person. Because he enlists her. He says, Grandma, please come with me to talk to this old grandma that owns this plot of land that my company is trying to buy. And that is a really interesting dynamic and scene because...
Talk about ballsy.
It's ballsy, but it ends up being this huge turning point for him because she sees this woman and talks to this woman and basically comes to an understanding of how hard both of their lives have been as a Korean living in Japan. Mm-hmm. And as they talk about that is when Solomon's mind changes. And do you mind if I talk about what happened? Because I can kind of explain it.
Dude, please, of course.
So the deal is going to go through. She has actually agreed to sell, and the bank is going to give her a very, very good price. Mm-hmm. But it's actually at the last minute Solomon who tells her in Korean in the meeting, you don't want to do this. Really. I know that your family wants you to do this. I know everybody that you know wants you to do this, but you yourself, you don't want to do this. He says this in Korean to her. So all of his Japanese colleagues have no clue what he's talking about. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's kind of this moment where like he really embraces, I am a Korean. I don't need to please these Japanese people. I need to do what makes me happy as a Korean person. And it's kind of like, isn't it kind of influenced by like that childhood love that he has?
Yeah, of course. Everything is nostalgia for us. The way that we were raised, the food that we ate, we shared with our family. But one of the interesting dynamics that the TV show beautifully captured was, your mom is Korean, but like growing up with Korean houses, we wonder, is like, why are you so strict and you can come off so mean and like, I need to think of a better word, but only thing that comes to mind is tiger mommy. They're very like protective, eat everything on your plate. Everything is very
Mm-hmm.
specific and disciplined. And and Solomon deals with that when he talks to his parents. He's like, Grandma, why are you like this? And then this TV show shows Sonja looking at like the pictures in her house, and then it goes back into, well, Solomon, grandson, like this because my parents were taken away by the etc. We lived under Japanese colonialism. We grew up with all this trauma, and then after
Mm-hmm.
40 years, you were born, and you had the opportunity to go to America, to go to Japan, and I felt that when I grew up, is like, oh, that's why my family is the way that is. There's a history to the way they behave in 2024. They were raised and had to deal with incredible tumultuous times, and it informs their behavior the way they raised us in this era. But I think as kids, as youth Korean kids, when we're growing up, we're confused and we don't understand because the Western influence is so liberal and you can do whatever you want, but then we come home, you take your shoes off, you have to bow, 잘 먹겠습니다,
Mm-hmm.
like all
Mm-hmm.
these specific things. But it's full story. You learn to appreciate it when you realize your grandma's story, when you realize your mom's story. Then you're like, okay, this makes sense. Of course. Yeah, of course I'll eat everything. Of course we
Mm-hmm.
respect is the number one priority, family and things like that.
I think this story really shows us, you can own your own identity and find out what it is. So in terms of owning it, right? In terms of like having our identities, like right now we're Pachinko watchers. So, the link is going to be in the description box. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We're going to be back on this channel to break down the show for you guys soon. But other than that, Charles, we'll see you guys in the next
Michael,
one, right?
thank you so much, bro.